Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Brian Katoulis. I'm a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy here at the Middle East. I want to thank all of you who are joining us for our webinar on the widening conflict in the Middle East. The key question is Lebanon on the brink of a full-scale war. Before I introduce the panel and the discussion, I do want to say a few things about the Middle East Institute, one of the oldest institutes focusing on the Middle East. We're doing a lot of work in this period of turmoil in trying to respond to events, but we're also doing a number of things to try to think ahead of the game. And we have two exciting new initiatives trying to look at US policy in the long run on Iran, as well as the Arab-Israel front that aim to look beyond sort of the next few days or even weeks, but a bit more longer term. And you'll be hearing more about that. The second thing I want to note is that MEI is in a period of exciting transition being led right now by Dr. Susan Saxton, our acting president and CEO. And we'll be having some announcements about some changes in the Institute coming up that you should all pay attention to and I think are really great. So stay tuned on all of that front, but let's get into the topic and the topic at hand and the panel that we have here. I'm going to introduce our panel in reverse order of who's going to speak first. And then we'll have about 30 minutes, 40 minutes of discussion. You can use the Q&A function if you want to join our conversation with some of your points and questions, and we'll try to weave those into the conversation, which will last for exactly 1 hour. David Hale, Ambassador David Hale, will speak to us on U.S. policy. He's a global fellow with the Wilson Center after serving as a foreign service officer with the rank of career ambassador. He's had many distinguished positions in U.S. government service, including serving as the U.S. ambassador to Lebanon from 2013 to 2015. He will speak third in our introduction here. Second speaker will be Eran Etzion, who is a diplomat and strategist. He's also a non-resident senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute. At one point, he was head of policy planning in Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we're lucky to have Eran join us from Israel. And last but not least is our colleague and my friend Rhonda Slim, who's the director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogue Program, which I want to note, we were talking beforehand that on October 7th, actually, we were in a Track 2 dialogue in Istanbul. And I've had the benefit of being part of these discussions, which some think tanks do this, but I think the work that Rhonda has done with MEI for over the years, and I hope we continue to do this on Track 2s, has added so much in terms of insight, flavor, connectivity with people that deepen our insights, which I think you'll see here on full display. In this discussion here. So I want to start with you, Rhonda. You're from Lebanon. You've been following the region for many, many years. You and I met in the region back in the 1990s, and we're definitely at a very troubled moment these days. Take us into what you see happening, particularly over the last 7 to 10 days in Lebanon, but then also the target of these attacks by Israel, Hezbollah, this movement, this terror group, this political movement and organization that has vexed so many people inside of Lebanon, but in the region as well. How do you see things today, Rhonda?
First, thank you, Brian, for your kind words. It has been really a pleasure, to be a colleague of yours. And it's an honor to share the virtual podium with David, Eran, and yourself, Brian. I'm going to be, first, let me contextualize the human crisis that's taking place in Lebanon. In the last, only since Monday, we have more than 700 people have died in Lebanon, including more than 50 children and women. Since midnight yesterday, we have 25 killed, lots of injured people in the country at a time when the healthcare sector is suffering from severe shortages in staff, medicine, equipment due to a multiple years of economic crisis that has been also taking place in the country, and at a time when Lebanese basically do not have savings to be able to weather this crisis economically. now and going forward. We have also an internal displacement crisis with which the government is definitely not equipped to deal with. Civil society, NGOs, international aid organizations are doing their best in helping. But if this conflict protracts, this displacement crisis will increase, will expand, on top of already an existing Syrian refugee crisis. So I just want to put this context in which this war, and we are at a war now, is taking place. So let me quickly now move what has been the impact of the last few days on Hezbollah. Inside Hezbollah, what has been the impact on the regional axis of resistance, what has been the impact on, and then where do we go from here? Quickly, and I will be speaking in bullet points because I don't have much time. First, I think the September 17 and 18 attacks on wireless communication devices, which Hezbollah used, which resulted in about 35 people killed, 1,500 Hezbollah cadre injured, has really dealt the part Hezbollah a heavy blow. It's not a deadly blow, it will be able with time to regroup, reorganize itself, partly because of how the organization is structured. I mean, they have a deep bench at every level, especially at the commander level. You are talking about 4 to 5 deputies, all of whom can step in when a commander, has been eliminated. I mean, if you look at also the Israeli strikes on these commanders, pretty much the founding core, the military founding core of Hezbollah has been wiped out. I mean, there is Nasrallah, in terms of leadership, and then there are the deputies of these commanders. But pretty much, so it's a very heavy blow that will affect their operational capacities in the short term and maybe in the medium term. But more importantly than the loss of people, I think it's a loss of trust inside the party. After all, these strikes, Israeli strikes, which have been targeting these commanders, the pagers, the wireless devices, which have been procured by some entity to Hezbollah, have been deeply infiltrated by Israeli intelligence. And that has sowed distrust and fear among the Hezbollah rank and file. And that's demoralizing, but also more, more incapacitating, if we can put it this way. Not incapacitating, but more, it affects even deeper and for a longer term the operational capacities. Trust is the glue that binds this organization together. It was founded on cells of 5 people each, and they all knew each other. And as it expanded, more people were brought in and more room then for corruption and infiltration increased. So how to regain that trust is going to be challenging, especially for Nasrallah himself. And finally, inside Hezbollah, it's the relationship between Hezbollah and their core constituencies. And by core constituencies, I don't mean only mostly Shias, but also other members of the Lebanese communities. I mean, after all, there is a covenant, a compact that has been established between Hezbollah and its core constituency that has been nurtured for years, a covenant based on the ability of Hezbollah to deter and deter Israeli attacks on their areas, on their people, and to defend once these attacks happen. And so far, Hezbollah has not been able to neither to deter nor to defend. And so this whole narrative of their missiles, precision guided, that are meant to deter Israeli attacks, to promote mutually deterrence equation, has really upended. And that has also going to have a long-lasting impact on the milieu of Hezbollah. Remember, para-state organization like Hezbollah can only grow and exist in a supporting milieu from which they can recruit. And once that relationship with that milieu is threatened or is frail, is fragile, then it becomes harder for them to continue and to persist. Let's move then to what does this mean for the regional axis of resistance? After all, Hezbollah is now an anchor in the Iran-led axis of resistance. It's not only, it has become the trainer of trainers. Take, for example, the last commander who was killed in an Israeli strike, Mohammed Srour. I mean, he was training Houthis in the use of drones. So not only has the loss of these commanders impacted the operational capacities of Hezbollah, it's going to impact the operational capacities of the Houthis. It's going to impact the operational capacities of the Iraqi militia. It's going to impact the operational capacity of some Syrian militias. So it has these, repercussions on the whole axis of resistance, and it has repercussions on Iran's regional strategies, forward defense strategy. I mean, the stability of Hezbollah is an essential ingredient to maintain this, forward defense strategy and to protect Iran from direct attacks on its territory. Again, and that's why, which brings me to the point about Iran coming to the defense of Hezbollah or not. There is a lot of debate about that inside Lebanon. And my point is that I think the threshold for Iran is going to be any existential threat to Hezbollah. Once Iran feels there is an existential threat to Hezbollah stability, then you are going to see Iran interfering. I mean, in the interim, you are going to see a continuing supply of weapons, munition, and possibly transfer of personnel, transfer of fighters, if Hezbollah requires it. Although I think they have anywhere from 30 to 50,000 fighters. So I don't think that at this point they are in need of fighters, but you might see eventually, if there is a protracted war, a transfer of fighters into southern Lebanon, especially also if there is an Israeli ground invasion. Which brings me to the last point. Where are we going from here in terms of scenarios? I think a scenario of a long attrition war, including an Israeli ground operation and long-term occupation of a security belt or zone in southern Lebanon, is not a far-fetched possibility. It will be devastating for Lebanon, no doubt, but it will be also equally a costly quagmire for Israel. I mean, Israel's past record with Lebanese ground wars is less than stellar, to say the least. They always ended badly, and they created more problems than they solved. Prime example is the 1982 war. They were able to remove the PLO fighter from Lebanon, and instead what they got, the founding of Hezbollah in 1982. And so Iran is in a better position, and I think he will speak next about where is Israel heading or where the Israeli government is heading. But I think at this point, given all the diplomacy that's taking place and before a ground invasion, there is really a unique opportunity, a short time window to go ahead with the implementation of most of UNSCR 1701, including the removal of Hezbollah Radwan forces to the north of Litani River, the introduction of the Lebanese army and UNIFIL into that part of the border, and maybe, if, with longer negotiation, maybe a resolution of the land border disputes. This, does not solve the problem that Hezbollah will regroup, will rearm itself way down the line, but at least in the short term, I think, Israel can leverage, if the Israeli prime minister is in that mode, is able maybe to leverage whatever military achievement they have had to date because of their technological prowess is into some kind of a political achievement and, enable the return of their residents to the north. Once an invasion starts, I think all bets are off. And I think you are going to be Hezbollah will be in a totally different mode. The critical point is going to be this linkage that Nasrallah made between the two theaters, the Lebanese theater and the Gaza theater. And as of Wednesday, as these proposals were discussed, so far he has been reluctant to de-link. The Israeli prime minister wants to de-link, wants to have a deal in Lebanon, but not necessarily a ceasefire deal in Gaza. I think and David will speak more about that, at least from what I read from the statement that came out of the White House, signed by both Macron and President Biden, is that there is still an interest in the US administration to connect them and maybe re-leverage an achievement in the north or a ceasefire in the north toward concluding a ceasefire and a release of hostages in Gaza. Whether this is achievable, I don't know. I think what I would like to say is that what needs also to happen as part of any diplomatic package going forward is to provide Nasrallah with enough ramp to climb down that tree, and that would save his face, you know. And I think regional countries, particularly, you know, Iran, can play an important role in the persuasion, in the thinking about the off-ramp, but also countries like France and Germany, which have, especially Germany, which have a lot of influence on Hezbollah than Israel, due to the long-standing relationship between German intelligence and Hezbollah. I think those can come up with ideas, with you know, incentives that Nasrallah could use to save face in climbing down that ladder.
Great.
I'll stop here.
Thanks for those deep insights, Rhonda. And one thing I want you to think about when I come back to another round of questions is another group of countries, which you just didn't mention right there, but the Arab countries, the Gulf Arab countries, and others. Yeah. Think about it. We'll come back to it. One thing I really feel lucky and am happy about working here at MEI is you look at this panel, we have a depth of expertise on Lebanon. We're about to hear on Israel, and then from Ambassador Hale on U.S. policy as well, and broadly in the region. I want to turn to you, Iran, and I should note to those of you tuning in at this moment, we didn't intentionally try to counter-program Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech at the UN General Assembly, but I understand he's just delivered, or he's still delivering, a speech where he actually had diagrams, like he did many years ago about the Iran nuclear program. This diagram, two pictures, one, the curse, which is Iran and its axis of resistance, and then a second diagram, the blessing, what his vision for, I think, was similar to what he said to Congress in July when he was here. Iran, you're there in Israel. Can you paint us a picture of how you see things, particularly given everything that Rhonda said about these recent US and France and other country moves to try to execute a diplomatic resolution? How do most Israelis see this, including those who have been displaced by this conflict, this mini war that's been going on in the northern borders of Israel?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm actually in New York for a couple of days, but I have been based in Israel. No problem. Just to be sure we're accurate. I'm happy to be here, and I'm going to make 5 quick points. The first is that in terms of the mood in Israel, in terms of the public discourse, in terms of the mindset, there has been a significant shift in the last week or so since the pager operation. It's interesting to note that we don't still know whether or not this was actually designed as kind of an opening gambit for a potential overall war with Lebanon, or was it a necessity because this clandestine operation, which was prepared for years and years, was about to be exposed. There is such a narrative, and I obviously don't know, but it does matter in terms of trying to analyze the Israeli government's real intentions. Were they really kind of planning to launch this, or were they dragged into it by this operational necessity? Nevertheless, the series of very successful operations, some of them really astonishing, gave Israelis a tremendous boost to their national morale, which was at all times low. The war in Gaza was and still is very deeply unpopular, and the majority of Israelis want to end it with a hostage deal and a ceasefire deal. And specifically, and this has also evolved in recent months, whereas a few months ago, Israelis were not willing to accept an end to the war with the hostage deal, and were trying to kind of square the circle by saying, okay, let's have the first phase of the hostage deal and then go back to fighting. At least in terms of the public opinion, now the majority is all for, okay, let's end this. This was the situation, again, until a couple of weeks ago, the pager operation. Now, with these operational successes, the mood has changed. And while, again, it's important to distinguish between the mood on Gaza and kind of the national psyche and the national will on Gaza compared to Lebanon. On Gaza, there's no change. People still want the war to be over. And actually, as we speak, and that's also very interesting, the dynamic between Netanyahu on the one hand, and the defense establishment on the other. Virtually, as he now speaks at the UN, as you correctly said, the IDF issued at this very moment, like 10 minutes ago, and I'm sure it's not a coincidence, an official statement saying that essentially the war in Gaza is over. And we have achieved our goals, and let's call it a day, which is quite interesting. But again, to focus on Lebanon, Israelis are now kind of all in. Okay, we have a huge operational success. Let's make sure it doesn't go to waste. We have a historic opportunity to wipe out Hezbollah, allegedly, theoretically, and kind of remove the threat forever and ever, and let's do it. And if we have to enter with a ground offensive, let's do that, and so on and so forth. I obviously think it's totally misguided, but analytically looking at the situation, this is where most Israelis are right now, and that's the first point that one needs to understand when looking at Israel right now. The second is, and again, this is badly misunderstood or kind of missed in the overall picture amongst Americans and amongst Europeans and amongst non-Israelis. And I'm going to be very clear and blunt on that, and I think it's of critical importance. Israel is no longer a functioning democracy. We do not have a functioning government. We do not have a functioning cabinet. We have a one-person rule, an autocratic rule, not officially, but for all practical purposes, by Netanyahu. He has completely crushed all the rules, regulations, norms of decision-making in Israel. He is not consulting with cabinet. He is not convening the government. He is in flagrant violation of any Israeli law and practice in terms of managing a war, any war in our history. And all the gatekeepers that were supposed to make sure this kind of thing doesn't occur have been, over the years, weakened, and especially since October 7th, have been significantly weakened and deterred. With some exceptions, this is where we are. So when you're trying to analyze the situation, or when you're dealing with this Israeli government, this is the first thing you need to understand. It's only Netanyahu. He is the decision maker, and it's going to be his call whether or not we enter in a ground offensive or not. When will the war end, if at all? And we just had another example of that with the brief agreement that he allegedly gave, he personally, without cabinet, allegedly gave to the Americans for this 21-day ceasefire, and then after a few hours canceled it altogether, and then after a few hours still issued another statement from his least watched Twitter account. He has a number of those, the official account of Prime Minister Netanyahu in English, which essentially nobody hardly ever watches, where he said, no, I'm not exactly denying the ceasefire altogether. I'm willing to listen. After he did obviously exactly that and said, there's no such thing. I was never approached. I never said anything. So this is where we are in terms of the way the country is ruled, and it needs to be understood. And it's very difficult from my experience, from my contacts with various officials, former officials, diplomats, journalists. They don't get it. They still hold this image of Israel in their mind as if, this is the Israel that they're familiar with. No, it's a different story. It's a different regime. So that's point number 2. Point number 3. What is Netanyahu's actual war aim? And note, Netanyahu's war aim doesn't matter what the cabinet decided officially or not. What is what's really going on? And it should have been clear by now that the only goal Netanyahu has is to perpetuate the war, both in Gaza and in Lebanon. And the main reason why we are now, after 12 months of bombardment in the north, why we are only now in that, shall we say, larger scale war with Lebanon, is that he has exhausted the potential of the war in Gaza. As I said before, most Israelis now want the war in Gaza over. Obviously, it's not over as far as Netanyahu is concerned, even if the IDF is trying to kind of call it a day, as I just said. But from Netanyahu's perspective, it's not over, and it's not going to be over until we have the total victory, which will never be defined. But because he's very attuned to Israeli public opinion, and because he knows most Israelis want the war in Gaza over, he launched the war in Lebanon. So now he has another war to quote unquote play with. And that, it may sound unbelievable to at least some of you. Trust me, that's what's going on. That's the only game as far as Netanyahu is concerned. Last 2 points. One relating to what Randa said about trying to de-link Gaza and Lebanon. It's true that, at least in terms of Israeli strategic thinking, there is such an attempt to de-link the two arenas. But I personally, and I know many others, don't really think that this is a viable aim. It's not, simply put, it's not going to happen. We do not have the capacity to squeeze Nasrallah into submission and into this delinking, not Nasrallah and not Iran, and not any other party who's interested, deeply interested and committed to that. Yes, we can exert a lot of pressure. Yes, we can change the equation. We can do many things, but we cannot delink it. And as we already saw in this American-French proposal, it's not a proposal for delinking. It's a proposal for actually re-embarking on the very same plan that was proposed before and trying to kind of get at it from a quote-unquote new angle. But it's the same plan. But again, note that when this plan was introduced, those in Israel that were trying to promote it, mainly from the defense establishment, were holding on to it as a delinking proposition. And even though it's not, that's how it was presented. So that's about the delinking. And the last point, which also is very important. The American administration doesn't get it. For whatever reason, they don't understand who they're dealing with. They don't have a good grasp on the situation. They are losing, if we can call it that, on the Israeli front. They're allowing Netanyahu to have his way. And they are creating a lot of damage, both to the Israeli national interest and also to the American national interest. And it's high time. I know it's, what is now, 40-something days before elections. I understand all the sensitivities. But if they want, and I'm sure they do, to avert further deterioration to a potential regional war, they need to change the calculus for Netanyahu. And they're able to do it. So far, they've chosen not to do it. And I think the stakes are getting higher and higher. Time is not on their side. And I would seriously advise them to kind of reconsider their position on that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Eran. I'm going to turn to Ambassador Hale. One thing I wanted to mention in the introduction is that he has this excellent new book, American Diplomacy Toward Lebanon, Lessons in Foreign Policy in the Middle East, that people should check out. We've got them available here at the Middle East Institute. Has got great insights in there. And what's great about Ambassador Hale is he knows Lebanon, he knows the Middle East, but he also has very much a global focus. And I'm going to lean on you to sort of draw the threads together that were put out there by both Eran and Randa, and try to weave together sort of the geostrategic picture, but then importantly, focus a bit more on U.S. policy in your assessment. Before I ask you the question, I want to highlight a programming note that next Wednesday here at MEI, we're going to have an event that assesses the Biden administration's approach that includes Eric Edelman and Mara Rudman and Patricia Karam at noon next week. And that's going to be tied to a report we're putting out looking at the Biden administration's approach. But Ambassador Hale, Eran just said the U.S. administration doesn't get it, and he described why. Randa also mentioned something about a possible diplomatic framework around UN Security Council 1701. You've sort of been watching these issues closely, working on these issues in the past. What's your assessment of the current administration's approach here, and what are the opportunities, risks going ahead?
Well, thank you very much, Brian, and thanks to my co-panelists. I want to start by underscoring how difficult these issues are for American policymakers and diplomats, and anything that I or others say, which can be valid criticisms, should always go back to that starting point about these are hard very hard matters. If they weren't, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about them. Second, there's a long tradition of the United States being the critical player in bringing about an end to violence between Israel and different actors in Lebanon, going all the way back to the early 1970s. Usually, we've actually managed in periods of time, much less than this, to bring about some kind of resolution, even if it's an unstable status quo. We've seen over the last year Amos Hochstein, the American Special Envoy, go on repeated trips to do precisely that, and he's not gotten anywhere. I think largely because the ingredients that the United States has had to offer, and it's not Amos's fault, but they're not really particularly calculated to change the balance of power and restore security and deterrence on Israel's northern border, which is what I believe the elected government of Israel is demanding as a condition for the return of their people. Now we've, of course, seen this uptick in violence as the Gaza war has become more, I think, in its end state. We have seen a predictable focus on the unfinished business to the north and the predicament that Israel has faced there for generations. And this has elevated American interests. But I would also, apart from what Israel's done on the ground, it's also coming out of the hothouse atmosphere of leaders and foreign ministers being all together in New York and feeling the pressure to not just have meetings, but to have meetings that actually produce outcomes. Well, the problem is that just announcing things without laying the groundwork for them in diplomacy rarely gets you what you want. And I think that's what we've seen here today. Why Israel would accept the premise of this offer, which is a 3-week ceasefire, which they are supposed to assure their people it's safe to go back to northern Israel, in return for rather vague promises of negotiations led by an administration in its twilight weeks, is really hard for me to understand why anyone would be terribly interested in that. And Hezbollah and the Iranians don't even need to respond because, as Iran has said, Nasrallah is going through the usual rope-a-dope that he does of mixed messages, where he will never actually say no for sure. He won't close the door because he doesn't want to bear responsibility for that. Keep the talks going, but have no real intention of doing anything other than what the current plan is. We don't know what that plan may be, but I think it's rightly or wrongly, successful or unsuccessful, tested by past behavior or not, likely to be about more violence. And the United States is in a very difficult position right now to offer anything that can change that trajectory. Focusing on 1701 as the starting point, I with all due respect to everybody, and I hope I'm wrong, but I do not believe is the right approach, because moving Hezbollah fighters above a buffer zone that no one can enforce, introducing peacekeepers when there's no peace and they have no mandate to even protect themselves, let alone civilians, redrawing a border that is, frankly, isn't disputed. It is an assertion by Hezbollah in order to have a pretext to maintain an opposition and resistance to an occupation that actually ended 20 years ago. None of these things change the equation. You have to change the calculus of those who launched this voluntary war against Israel on October 8th, the day after the Gaza war started. And that's Tehran. The address is Tehran, not Beirut. And this is the fundamental problem for US policy and diplomacy right now, is you have an administration that really doesn't want to face that reality, not because they're intellectually unable to do so, but they really don't want to face the consequences. In fact, they may prefer a sort of détente with Iran, while they then, as an administration, a new administration, can regroup and determine what the Iran policy will be. And unfortunately, I don't believe that the Israeli leadership is willing to tolerate that kind of, quote, détente, because that means going back to the pre-October 7 status quo, with Hezbollah and Iran having the hand on the spigot of violence against Israeli civilians in the north. So the United States has a real dilemma here. I'm not saying they shouldn't keep trying, but they should probably focus more on the real source of the problem, which is in Tehran, not in Lebanon.
Great. Let me actually pick up on that point you just made and turn to Rhonda, because I actually think the two different comments that you offered paint a really textured picture of the complications and the challenges the current administration faces. And Rhonda, you were talking about the possibilities for diplomacy, mostly in the short run, I think. And I think you appreciate the challenges Iran poses across the region. How would you respond to what Ambassador Hale just said there in terms of Iran's role and its motivations, and essentially has had a strategy of deepening its presence? And it dovetails with something you said in terms of its Iran's forward defense strategy in the region. But what do you think that means for the possibilities for diplomacy, not only achieving a temporary ceasefire, but then taking root in the long run?
No, I think right now Iran is interested. This Iranian regime, at least part of it, as exemplified by the delegation that was in New York, is interested in making a deal with the Americans. Now, they came to New York and basically presented their message and presented their narrative. Now, how influential this group is going to be in the scheme of things going forward, I don't know, and how receptive the next administration will be in making a deal with Iran. I think both candidates, presidential candidates, Harris and Trump, have said they would be interested in at least exploring the negotiations with Iran going forward. And I think Iran does not want to get dragged right now in a war that will make it difficult for a US president, especially an incoming president next year, to enter these negotiations. I mean, it's going politically difficult. And so I think they will be, in a way, and as I said, it's a short-term solution. I've always said that some elements of 1701 are implementable, not all, but at least as a short-term solution to avert a ground war with a short time window, I think you are going to see both Hezbollah and Iran amenable to some kind of a temporary negotiated solution. I understand the claim. I understand the arguments made by David about how Israeli leadership feels about that, about how the Israeli public feels about that. But absent this basically short-term fix, could expand to even medium-term, we are looking at an attrition war that will be, again, devastating for Lebanon, and that will be, major, very costly for Israel. And who knows what else, and who else will be involved, and what are the implications for regional stability writ large. After all, take it, I mean, you have an Iraqi militia leader threatening UAE, with missiles and drones, if this war were to protract and to continue. And so that's my approach to it, and that's how I would respond to David. There is no perfect solution. There is no perfect fix. There is no long-term fix. There is a short-term, maybe medium-term fix that averts a war that can be devastating for both sides, prepares ground for negotiations, and wait for the next administration to pick up that file. But again, it's a very short time window. After that, I think all bets are off.
Great. Before I get to some of the questions we have coming in, and we've got some good questions, I wanted to turn to Iran to offer his comments on this exchange between Ambassador Hale and Rhonda. Yeah. And you depicted a picture where there's this effort to de-link Gaza from Lebanon. Where do you think the Israeli public, and I understand your point, and I think a lot of people do, about Bibi and how Israel is no longer functioning democracy, but where do the Israeli public, where does it stand? You mentioned Gaza is seen one way, but the northern border in Lebanon and the threat from Hezbollah is seen another way. What do you think about this notion of at least a temporary fix as a bridge to something wider? Where do you think the center of gravity is inside of Israel on that?
Yeah, we obviously, Ambassador Hale and I, need to have a deeper conversation on what is a realistic goal from an overall perspective, both American and Israeli, regional. What is a realistic goal vis-a-vis Iran and vis-a-vis Hezbollah? And I don't think, a regime change in Iran is a realistic goal. And I don't think anything but kind of detente with Iran can actually be achieved by any American administration or by any Israeli government. But that obviously merits a deeper conversation. And in terms of what is possible vis-a-vis Hezbollah and Lebanon, I am more on the Rwanda side. I do think, I try always not to limit myself in terms of my thinking about these issues. And I would very much like to have a much better arrangement than 1701, but which I know intimately. I was part of its formulation. But right now, at least, I fail to see a realistic possibility, again, by any American administration after the elections, to bring about a dramatically different UN Security Council resolution or a bilateral Lebanon-Israel agreement, which of course will not be only be bilateral. The US will be a party to it. Iran will be a party to it indirectly. I fail to see something which will be a dramatic improvement on 1701, on let's say an upgraded 1701. And by upgraded, I mean, I would go for a Chapter 7. I would go for a much more robust mandate for the UN peacekeeping force or peace enforcing force. And I would make these kinds of improvements. But it would still be, by and large, the overall framework that 1701 kind of epitomizes. And I would very much love to hear what maybe you or others have in mind as something which is dramatically different. And lastly, on the Israeli side, I cannot emphasize it enough. There is the Netanyahu position, which I portrayed. It does not represent the Israeli interest. It does not represent the majority of Israelis. And it does not represent the position of the Israeli defense establishment, including the defense minister. Okay, Ambassador Hale, you said, I fail to see why the American-French proposal could be attractive. The defense establishment of Israel was very much willing and interested in embracing it. Why? Because they want this war to end. And they need the hostages back, and they're dying by the day. And they need to begin doing something on Gaza, which will create the possibility for a different regime, which is not Israeli and not Hamas. And all of this is going the opposite direction from the Israeli interest, the way the defense establishment sees it. So it's not like, we have time and we can pound Hezbollah for another few months. With each day, yes, we have military achievements, which I don't underestimate, but we incur enormous damages on all other fronts, including the domestic front, the dictatorial coup, which is ongoing, the fact that the defense minister is now not invited to the most important national security discussions. Huh. Can you imagine? That's what's happening. So it's not a normal situation by any stretch of the imagination, and it must be curtailed as soon as possible. Thank you.
So, yeah, not to get stuck in this cul-de-sac, but I do think it's a really rich exchange. I want to offer the chance for Ambassador Hale to offer his reactions to this. And then after that, I'll move the conversation back to the point that I flagged for Rhonda, but also want you all to think about is the role of Arab states too, particularly those, and I'll mention some things that has happened in the last few days in the realm of diplomacy. But Ambassador Hale, how do you react to both what Iran and Rhonda had to say about sort of the pathway here and what's possible for a U.S. administration to try to do, given what you articulated about your view on Iran's role and its partners like Hezbollah?
Well, these are incredibly difficult matters, and there are no simple solutions to them. And yes, you can and may have to look at it from a very short-term perspective, but then that means it's only going to be a matter of weeks or months before you're faced with the same problem once again. And I think that is the predicament that Israeli leaders are trying to grapple with, in my humble opinion. I didn't use the word regime change. I don't advocate for it. And even if I did, it wouldn't matter because it's not in America's power. What I was saying is that unless and until we can construct a longer-term strategy that changes Iranians' cost-benefit analysis, because right now it's their Arab proxies who are paying most of the prices, and they don't really care. It's what costs will be imposed on the Iranians that might change their motivation so that they actually do want stability and security in South Lebanon, in which case some of these compromise measures related to improving 1701 might actually make a difference. But going about this by just fiddling with 1701 without any real change in the power equation or the Iranian mentality isn't going to accomplish anything, just as 1701 really fell far short in its implementation what people hoped in 2006.
Great. Thank you. I had mentioned before that we were going to draw on some questions, and there was one that relates to something that I teed up for Rhonda already, and it comes from David Mack, and I'm going to use it and characterize it. David, Ambassador Mack, we're lucky to have in the MEI circles for years, and as a retired ambassador, knows the region very, very well. He asks a question about whether Jordan and other Arab partners of the U.S. are prepared to use their leverage to get change. He focuses not only on the Palestinian Authority, he focuses on the Palestinian Authority. I'd like to broaden the question and turn to you, Rhonda, by mentioning two things that happened just in the last 48 hours or so. One, as we all noted, there was this U.S.-French initiative, the 21-day ceasefire. What's interesting is that, to me, is it includes many European partners and also those in Asia, but also Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar. And Iran had noted the back and forth and in the intrigue inside of the Israeli government and Bibi's different sort of positions on this. And clearly the White House, if you look at their statements, are pretty frustrated with what's going on there. So that's one thing that happened. The second, which is so far afield, but I think it's worth mentioning because it relates to Ambassador Mack's question about Palestine, which is that the Saudi Arabia announced the creation of an international alliance aimed at creating a Palestinian state and a two-state solution, which is, you know, all fine and well at a time when war seems to be gathering. But I know they're also planning in the next few weeks to actually host another conference of the Arab and Muslim countries. Question to you, Rhonda, first is, where do you see the role of Arab states, particularly those in the Gulf, but those like Jordan and Egypt that have relations, open relations with Israel, in trying to shape the context of the diplomatic choices as well as the security choices that Ambassador Hale has highlighted in some of his remarks here?
For me, it was interesting that Egypt was not one of the signatory on that statement, particularly because Egypt, along with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, are part of this 5-member committee, in addition to the US and France, that has been trying now to broker understanding among Lebanese parties on the presidency, you know, because we have not had a president for a number of years now, and this committee has been working for some time without much, results. And so the fact that Egypt did not endorse the statement, at least for me, it was interesting. Look, I think and let me be specifically on the conflict in Lebanon. I totally agree with David, is that the United States is right now the only country, and of course, France has always had the Lebanon file in the international community. But in terms of actual influence, you know, on the main protagonist, we have two really international regional stakeholders who can really influence the choices of the parties going forward. And I'm saying it with a big caveat after what Iran said. On one hand, you have United States and Israel, and we have not seen that much of an influence on the Gaza file until now. Hopefully, you know, who knows, on Lebanon, maybe it's different, but who knows? I'm skeptical after hearing Iran. And then you have Iran with the influence on Hezbollah, which is the other main protagonist in this conflict. Other countries, have not had, especially the 3 Gulf countries, except maybe a little bit Qatar, but definitely UAE and Saudi Arabia have had not good relationships with Hezbollah, do not have much influence over their decision making, So in that respect, I see also the endorsement of that statement by these 3 Arab countries in a way as a response to what the Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi said at the UN when he was being asked about how to support Hezbollah, and right away he said, "Oh, Arab countries should rise up to the defense of Hezbollah." And I think their endorsement of a ceasefire proposal is their response to Iranian strategy in Lebanon, in the region, and I think it's a right call by the 3. But in terms of influence, at least on one of the stakeholders on one of the parties in this conflict, I mean, these 3 countries do not have that much influence. I think if negotiations need to happen about a deal, it has to be French, American, of course, but also French mediating that understanding with Iran, because these are the 3 outsiders who I think have the most influence in dictating, at least as far as Hezbollah is concerned, their decision-making calculus.
Thanks, Rhonda. The richness of this discussion makes me think that MEI, we here need to make these conversations a little bit longer than 60 minutes, because I'm looking at the clock as well as the thoughtful questions coming in from some of our audience. I want to turn one of those questions that we received to Ambassador Hale, and then if any of you else want to comment on it, because we really haven't covered it yet, but I think it is interesting. And the question is this, is there seems to be a deafening silence on the situation in Lebanon from the Syrian regime. And Syria, of course, is a country that MEI covers very well. If you're not following our colleague Charles Lister's work on Syria, you're missing out. He's got great insights on what's going on there day in and day out. Ambassador Hale, you've worked sort of across the region and the world. How do you think the question here is, will this escalation between Israel and Hezbollah affect Syria, if at all? I noted also in the news that some Lebanese are actually crossing the border into Syria, if that's correct from those news reports, because of the turmoil there. How do you see sort of that piece of the puzzle, the Syrian piece in this equation, affecting all of this?
Well, I don't think Syria helps anything, to be honest with you. And I think if Lebanese are fleeing to Syria, it's just a sign of absolutely how desperate their lives are right now today in Lebanon, which we all, as Rhonda started at the beginning, need to remember continually.
Yeah.
And I don't want to put words in Iran's mouth, but he made the observation, and a little side note to me just now, that 1701 did produce 20 years plus of quiet along the border. But I would argue the reason for that is that Hezbollah then spent much of that period of time engaged in a war in Syria. And much of the proxy tit-for-tat war between Israel and Hezbollah shifted to the Syrian theater, as we well know, where Israel used its access to Syria with Russian tolerance to interfere with Hezbollah arms shipments into Lebanon. So I don't think that there was anything to applaud about South Lebanon, but rather a transference to the huge vacuum that was created by the civil war and the unfolding situation in Syria. If I understand your question correctly, Brian, I don't see how anything in Syria actually helps, and I don't see anything that's going to be bringing about some kind of resolution to the problems that Israel is encountering right now, likely to contribute to stability in Syria over the long run either.
Right. And what do you see, Ambassador Hale, the current U.S. approach to Syria? How would you characterize it? Because these theaters obviously are separate, but then in many ways they're interlinked. Iran and others certainly see that in that sort of way.
Well, I'm not here to defend or, by the way, attack the administration, but it seems that their Middle East policy, if I can put words in mouths, it was said JCPOA, a return to the nuclear agreement, and to de-emphasize the Trump administration's focus on the malign behavior, as they called it, of Iran in these various sub-theaters in the Middle East, Syria being one of them. They, for whatever reason, we don't have time to get into it, they didn't get the deal, but they haven't really, to my opinion anyway, landed on an alternative strategy.
Yeah.
And we're at the end of the term, so that's the way it is. And I think one of the obvious decisions that we're going to face, whoever is elected in November, will be, what will our new Iran strategy look like? I think we know what a Trump administration strategy will look a lot like what we saw during their first term, times 10, maximum pressure times 10. What Harris, as a continuation or partial continuation of Biden, will do, we don't know. She hasn't spoken to it. There'll probably be more of an emphasis on that détente atmosphere that I alluded to earlier than certainly than the Trump approach.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just two other things. We are re-releasing MEI today, our Harris-Trump tracker, just on their positions staked out in the campaign, as well as their time in office on Middle East issues, something that we're updating once a month as this campaign moves forward. But we're not really evaluating the validity of their positions, just sort of displaying them out there. And then secondly, I mentioned at the outset that Iran and the Iran Initiative here at Middle East Institute, Alex Vatanka and Patricia Karam and others, we're going to be putting out a series of products that try to shape that discussion, whomever wins the election in the next administration. Iran,
can I have a one finger? You were going to approach me, so go ahead.
Yeah, go for it. No, do your one finger, and then I'm going to be mindful of the clock. I'm going to ask you another question. Go ahead.
My one finger has a kind of a picture of Putin on it. And,
and which finger is that?
Take your guess. I think for some reason, a lot of times when we have these discussions, we neglect to appreciate and to analyze and to kind of make future scenarios regarding Russia. And I think it's a mistake. And they are potentially a key factor in this. And for example, when I imagine a second Trump administration, I see actually not a tougher policy on Iran, but a coordinated Iran policy, coordinated with Putin, which will be very different from what we saw in the first Trump administration. And I think that's at least a realistic a possibility as kind of a maximum pressure approach. And that's just an example. Then, of course, whenever we mention Syria, we must kind of factor into consideration the fact that Russia is there. And for Russia, their probably most important strategic achievement in the Middle East in the last, I don't know, 2-3 decades was their ability to take control of Syria in a surprise strategic move, which was phenomenal. So I think there's a lot that Russia is thinking about, is not acting yet, but will certainly pull a lot of, or some of it at least, out of their hat once the elections in the US are decided.
Yeah.
That was my one finger.
No, but it's a very good point. And because we're running short on time, before I wrap up, maybe Rhonda, one last question to you, but if you could give a brief response so we can keep it on time. As I mentioned, you've been engaged in Track 2 and conflict resolution efforts for decades. And we've been engaged in US-Russia dialogue. We've talked to Chinese counterparts. How do you see sort of this picture that Iran paints here, which I think is quite accurate, the Middle East being a centerpiece of this struggle for influence and competition among some of the other global powers like Russia and China? How do you see that? What are the potential benefits? Very briefly, but then what are the risks for the next administration, US administration?
No, I see the potential risks of that, but also I see the region trying to reorganize itself, in anticipation of this. And you are seeing a lot of these mini alignment taking place in the region, mini projects going, putting different groups together, Turkey with Arab countries, the détente and the rapprochement between the Gulf countries and Iran. I don't see that changing, and when we talk with our Gulf colleagues in many of these dialogues about how do they see their relationship with Iran, for example, evolving? How do they see the relationship with Israel evolving? And I think they would say, they would like to pursue both of these tracks. And if anything, what happened now, because of the Gaza war and the fact that their capitals were not hit by some drones and missiles, in fact, it's offered as evidence that their détente or their outreach to Iran was the correct strategy, and they are not going to be abandoning it, whether it is a Trump administration, whether it's a Harris administration. And so you are going to see more and more the region basically reorganizing itself while this competition is taking place among the superpowers.
No, and I think that's an interesting note to close on. It's one I've seen in various trips in the last year, particularly in some of the Arab Gulf countries, where they maybe 10 years ago had a much more public and private hawkish tone about Iran. I think that does present a complication no matter who gets elected in this country, and how that aligns with what's going on inside of Israel, as Ambassador Hale and Iran described as well. And that's an important part of the strategic puzzle. As I said about 10 minutes ago, I wish we would do these panels more along the lines of 85 minutes or 90 minutes or something like this, because I feel like we scratched the surface on some of the biggest trends. I actually am proud that we did not only just offer commentary on the breaking news, including Netanyahu's speech at the UN General Assembly, what was happening, but you all three helped us paint a picture and offer a textured analysis of the broader context and where this might all go and what this means for the next US administration. And we at MEI, thank you for donating your time and expertise to us, and we thank the audience for joining us. So as I mentioned, we've got a lot of programming every day. Our team, Molly Donahue and others, are working hard to put some good ideas out there, and I appreciate you all joining, and we'll continue the conversation in future events. Thanks.